Hello, everyone. I think the introduction was fine. Maybe I should add that I'm talking about this. I've been working. I've worked as a quality manager in the agribusiness sector for 6 years, the International Union of Conservation for 5 years, and now I've been with the UNEP-WCMC around 6 years. And in the middle of that, I worked for a consultancy called the Biodiversity Consultancy for only 1 year. They were expert on the application of one sustainability standard for biodiversity, which I will talk about now. And I chose this title because I think that the end point of all of this is to achieve positive outcomes from corridors. And this is for biodiversity and for people. But I'm going to focus on sustainability stand positive outcomes for biodiversity as an endpoint, acknowledging that that will have an impact also on people. And we don't live in a vacuum. We live in a socio-political system, and we can't forget that. But I will leave that aside for a bit when I'm discussing these technical things about positive outcomes for biodiversity. So I'm going to talk about what are sustainability standards. I'm going to give a case study of best practice, and then I'm going to talk about challenges and opportunities in practice of applying that. And that includes the mitigation hierarchy, no net loss, net gain. I'll talk about all of that in a quick way. So what are sustainability standards? So if you think about a development corridor cycle, and this is one I've done through my readings, we have a conception and a design phase that interact with each other, where the politics behind the decision of a corridor happening or not happening, and where to do it and how to do it is happening. We have an implementation phase, which is implementation of what is called soft infrastructure, which includes policies and regulations for that corridor or that apply to that corridor, but also developing partnerships and collaborations to implement that corridor. And of course, then we have implementation of hard infrastructure, which is a road, a bridge, a dam, and all of those are projects, independent projects that may depend one another. You need a road to get to the mine, for example, but they may be independent or happen in parallel. And at the same time, there should be monitoring and evaluation going on all this happening. So as I said, each project will have its own workflow of conception, design. So it's a quite complex process. And based on what John has discussed, the strategic environmental assessment space could be this one in red, highlighted in red, where it could support a corridor. And at the same time, the environmental impact assessment space would be at a project level, as we discussed in the blue circle. So this is where we're standing now, based on John's presentation. But so then, what are sustainability standards and some certification schemes? Where do they fall? So standards and certification schemes are led by a wide range of institutions. You know, the World Bank has its standards, IFC has its standards. There are other organizations that have different standards. They are not required by law, but they add another layer of impact management to what is already legally required by countries. And there are a lot of sustainability standards. There are financial, agricultural, forestry, textile. You know, they have different procedures, different policies. I'll explain that in a minute. But just to be aware that it's a very big landscape. There's a lot of different procedures and institutions trying to add up a level over what is legally required by countries. And there are also infrastructure standards. I'm going to talk today only about IFC, International Finance Corporation Performance Standards, and only about one of them, which is the one on biodiversity. So just setting that scope. But standards and certification schemes are a response to a demand of doing things better in addition to what is required in each country. So we should not forget that this needs to happen. It doesn't substitute that legal requirement. And usually the standards are, they are embedded under a sustainability framework or institution. That institution, to implement a sustainability framework, develops policies. And those policies are then implemented through various things. It could be standard procedures or performance standards. It could be guidelines. those performance standards or standard procedures could come with guidance notes, with manuals, with protocols, or specific tools. So, you know, there is a lot of complexity, but this is the hierarchy of what we're going to talk about now. And of course, there are infrastructure sustainability standards, which I'm reading about as we speak almost. And there is a very interesting review on sustainability standards. It reviews 12 standards. They are not all infrastructure specific, but it was with the infrastructure investor lens. And the conclusion I got from it so far, I haven't finished reading it, is there's no consensus around common standards and sustainability metrics. And there is a need to demonstrate the value of these standards to managers, engineers, and contractors who are developing these projects on the ground. It's an interesting report. I'll tell you more about it when I finish reading it, but here you have it. It's quite easy to find. So today we're going to talk about IFC PS6. So do you all hear me well? I hope yes. No?
Yes, we do.
Okay, yes, good.
Okay, yes.
Just checking in. So IFC, what is IFC? So it's a sister organization of the World Bank. It is the largest global development institution focused exclusively on private sector funding. So they give money to big projects of the private sector. And IFC has a sustainability framework within which there is a policy on environmental and social sustainability. There are other policies. I'm just focusing on what our topic today. And within it, the policy is implemented through 8 performance standards. And the standards have guidance notes, which is more technical detail about how you implement the standards. So in our case, international IFC PS6 stands for International Finance Corporation Performance Standard 6 on biodiversity and sustainable management of living natural resources. Very, very long. That's why we all say IFC PS6. The performance standard is composed of 9 pages. It's that one over there, and it has a guidance note of 50 pages. The standard was developed in 2012. And it was updated, the guidance notes, which is where the detail is, it was updated in last year. So I'm going to go through now the basics of that standard. So what are the key points of this particular biodiversity standards in the IFC? So companies who want to get funds from IFC have to comply with the requirements of this performance standard, but also with all the other 7. As I said before, it's not a certification system, not a substitute. It's just a condition to get access to the funding that IFC provides, which might not be the only funding that this donor gets, and you know, not many companies might build their infrastructure without borrowing money from IFC. So it's only applicable in that space. And IFC carries usually a review of existing impact assessment to the project, and usually quite often, and that was one of the main jobs at the consultancy, required to do additional work to meet IFC PS6 requirements, which is what we're going to talk about now. And why is this important? Why am I talking about this one and not about others, in addition to because it's the one I know about? But it's also because it's seen as best practice. Many banks, many development banks all over the world, if you read the standards, they are almost identical or very similar to IFC PS6. So it led the way on how to do this. Even the World Bank standards, who were updated recently, they have aligned now with IFC PS6 in terms of biodiversity risk management. And the Equator Banks Principal Association, you can look for it on Google. They have a website, endorse this standard. And to get context of what is this association, it's quite important. It covers 70% of private finance globally. So this is becoming a big thing, or has become over the next year. So that's why I'm focusing on this one. So what are the requirements of this standard for a particular project? So the first thing you need to do is to delineate a discrete management unit, which is basically the area of influence of a project you're looking funding for. You have to identify critical natural and modified habitat within that area, and I'll explain in detail what those three terms mean. And then you have to assess direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts. So John has talked about impacts in the previous presentation, and it requires a rigorous and demonstrable application of the mitigation hierarchy, which is the path to achieve no net loss, and it requires to do that in natural habitat and net gain. And the IFC requires this to happen in critical habitat. And it also requires to identify priority ecosystem services, but I won't talk in this with a lot of detail. So I'm going to talk about these three things, the three terms that are central to the performance standard, the mitigation hierarchy, which is the underpinning framework, and that leads to no net loss and net gain. So what is the mitigation hierarchy? It's a sequence of actions to manage biodiversity impacts, and it has 4 steps. The first step is avoid. So when you're carrying out a project, you try to avoid significant impacts. So you prevent damaging actions before they take place. And avoidance is it should be the most important step where you actually reduce most impacts. But of course, it's impossible not to have any impacts with anything you do. If you build a road, you're building a road, you're physically occupying a space. So the next step is minimize, which is reduce the severity of impacts because of the project. And this includes direct and indirect impacts. It's not only about the direct footprint. So it includes, for example, if you build a road, the people who come and live to that area because the road is there will have an impact on natural resources as well. And you have to consider that as an indirect impact because of your project. Restore is a 4th step, so it means recreate elements or actively enhance the recovery of the environment in the pre-project state. And then offset is the last step, which is compensate measurably, so you have to be measurable for impacts. And how this leads to what we call no net loss or net gain. So here's a quite famous diagram that explains that. So initially you have a pink thing, which is the impact you're going to have in a project if you do nothing. If you go through the steps of the mitigation hierarchy, you're likely to reduce those impacts, but you still have pink, which is called significant residual impacts. And those can be overcome through offsets. And if you just compensate for what has been lost through offset, you're achieving no net loss. So it's defined as the point in which project-related impacts are balanced by measures taken to avoid, minimize, and restore them, and then offset them. And if you go beyond that and you create new biodiversity, or you avoid the loss of biodiversity was going to be lost but this is very controversial, of course, but I want to go through the framework. Then you achieve net positive impact. Obviously, this offset part is the most controversial part of it all for many, many reasons I can't go through in detail in this presentation, but I will reflect on them later because they are the key of net gain and no net loss. How do you do offsets and how do you implement them? But going now to the next definitions, I'm going to define for you critical habitat, modified habitat, and natural habitat. So modified habitat, as IFC defines it, is areas that contain a large proportion of animal and plant species that are substantially modified. So this includes mapping and identifying them, which the impact assessment that was done because of the legal requirements might have already done. So the starting point is always the impact assessment. And the IFC requires the client to minimize the impacts and apply the mitigation measures, so modify habitats that hold a significant value, the impacts are minimized. So that's what is required to this particular modified habitat. And then we have natural habitats, which are areas composed of viable assemblages of plants and animal species. And they don't have to be essentially modified. And what the IFC requires to the client is design mitigation measures to achieve no net loss in natural habitats. And then the last part of this, which is a subset of natural habitats, it's critical habitat. So basically, IFC is asking the client to map their space in terms of modified habitat, critical habitat, and natural habitat. And for critical habitat, it has 5 criteria to define what a critical habitat is. So the 5 criteria consider globally endangered species, restricted range or endemic species, concentration of migratory and congregatory species, highly threatened and unique ecosystems, and key evolutionary processes. And this includes most legally protected areas, key biodiversity areas, World Heritage Sites, national priorities, and also global priorities. And the IFC PS6 will require the client to develop a biodiversity action plan designed to achieve net gains of this critical habitat that has been identified. This term critical habitat since then has been used extensively across the standard world, and the definitions are very similar. Sometimes even they just refer to IFC PS6 definition of critical habitat. And I'm just going to give you an example of the detail of the critical habitat. So for example, for criterion 1, which is about threatened species, a critical habitat would be an area that supports globally important concentration of IUCN red list endangered of critically endangered species, and it has to be more than 0.5% of the global population and more than 5 reproductive units of that critically endangered or endangered species. So quite specific. And then another example, it includes areas that support globally important concentration, again, IUCN red list vulnerable species, and the loss that would result in a change of the IUCN red list status. So this is just one example of one of the criteria. And here is the third criterion, which is as appropriate areas containing important concentration of nationally or regionally listed endangered or critically endangered species. So as you can imagine, identifying critical habitat is not going to be easy. It needs data and it needs resources. So I'm going to walk you through a bit the practical process. So the first thing you have to do is a stakeholder consultation and literature review, which mainly involves reviewing any environmental impact assessment or strategic environmental impact assessment of your area of influence and look at everything that has been done around that area in terms of biodiversity risks and talk to stakeholders and understand the context. And do fieldwork if necessary. Then you have to identify what additional field data collection do you need for the critical habitat identification. So collect field data, engage with qualified specialists, collect and go through this second step. The first step would be to determine critical habitat after you've consulted stakeholders and collected additional data. And it is determining spatially explicitly with maps and data, where is that critical habitat? And it requires an analysis and interpretation of the desktop and field data collected. So this is an overview of a definition of concepts in IFC PS6 and the framework that underpins it, that is a mitigation hierarchy. So yeah, there's a lot of detail in all of these things I've talked about. I can't go into all the detail, but from what I've told you, there are some challenges and there's also some opportunities. So for example, how would the mitigation hierarchy, this framework would be applied to a development corridor, which I'm not aware with, nobody has done yet. So to avoid, for example, you could redesign infrastructure to avoid impacts on high biodiverse areas or water provision of natural systems or any important ecosystem services and incorporate these into the strategic documents. You could minimize impacts in a development corridor by identifying best practice of impact minimization, wildlife crosses, water management, disaster risk management, and use that to engineer a better infrastructure. You will still have impacts, of course, because you're building things on top of other things. So ecological restoration of areas impacted during infrastructure construction, it's another thing you can do following this decision-making, this framework of risk management. And then the last one is offsets. So you still are going to lose biodiversity. So you identify opportunities for offsets and compensation across projects in the development corridor and in that area of influence. Offsets are very controversial, complicated concept. So I wanted to talk a little bit about it. So compensation is a big term, and within the compensation term, offset is just one part of it. within a grading of things that you can do. You can do no compensation whatsoever of restoring biodiversity loss. I'm talking here about compensating biodiversity loss. You could just invest in NGOs or in other things, but not specifically addressing losing habitats or species. So you just investing in NGOs, but you could specifically say, okay, I'm losing 100 hectares of this particular wetland. I'm going to compensate that exact type of biodiversity. So that would be an offset. And you could achieve no net loss or, as discussed before, positive impact. But doing an offset, it's very complex. And this is just a list of things you have to consider, especially in a development corridor. And it's, of course, apply the mitigation hierarchy, you know, but considering the impacts of people, considering the landscape approach, look at it as an holistic way, because you cannot offset all the time and everything. There's a limit in the landscape of what you can do. Being transparent, use the traditional knowledge and the scientific knowledge in that area, define the metrics. So it is a complex process in the path to achieve net gain or net loss. And the devil is in the detail, and this I've learned this very much. And the detail is not explored by many people. So, for example, what is the approach for ecological compensation? I said before, what are you doing? Are you compensating exactly for what's being lost? What is the approach you're taking? And there's a lot of scientific research now on alternatives to the traditional offsets, because offsets, of course, require modeling of counterfactual scenarios and what would happen if I don't do this. So it's quite complex. What are the right methods to measure losses and gains? Are we talking about number of species, habitat quality, habitat condition? Is it only area of habitat? We don't care about condition. So all these things are really important. How do priorities change as you change the design? So you have to avoid things. You may impact other things. So it's an iterative process. Please avoid, minimize, restore, and offset. How do you ensure long-term implementation to achieve positive outcomes? Most of these projects are 30-year projects. So, and the net gain promise is 30 years ahead. So how does that work in terms of resources over those 30 years? And very important, which I acknowledge I'm not addressing here, what are the practical consequences in the ground for people? If you're deciding to create a new habitat somewhere else, who is living there? How is that going to affect local communities? So all important questions that I'm not going to respond today, but they are food for thought. And finally, is it really possible to achieve positive outcomes for biodiversity through a development corridor? So I like to approach this in a logical way, and this is part of the research I'm doing through my PhD. So if you imagine a percentage of impact of corridors in the y-axis and the x-axis, the impact type, and you define direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts, if you do nothing, you will have 100% of the initial predicted impact of a project. If you avoid, you might reduce the indirect and direct cumulative impacts. If you avoid significantly, maybe to 40%, as I show here. Then you can reduce a bit more, but not much more by minimizing, by using the right engineering processes and best practice. And then if you restore the areas, you can reduce a bit more what was destroyed during the construction. And of course, then you have a residual impact and you have to offset it. But the question is, can this be achieved? Where, how, and by when? And if this cannot be achieved, is this percentage loss acceptable for the system? So are we willing to accept that X hectares of this important habitat is going to be lost? And if not, what are we going to do about it? And then you come back to the compensation discussion. So I don't have the answer for development corridors. We are hoping that we can explore it over these years. But I think if it's something that to aspire for, it's game changing, and I think it's something worth looking at through this project. And finally, that's the end of my talk. I would like to. I was looking into the sustainability standards of infrastructure, one called SURE, and when you get in the website, this is the first message you get. And I don't know, it made me think about the work we're doing. It's probably becoming more important now. At least the standard representatives are taking it as as a warning at the beginning of the website. So thank you very much for your time. I finished now. Thanks.